Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us This Week in America online, thisweekinamerica.us. Kathleen Brady brings her 25 years of experience as a certified career life management coach, author, and educator to Preferred Transition Resources, where she is director of coaching. Kathleen helps lawyers identify and integrate their personal and professional goals. She launched her career in 1985 as a counselor in Columbia Law School's placement office, then transitioned to Assistant Dean of Career Services at Fordham University School of Law. Later, she was responsible for recruitment and professional development on the employer side. In addition to her work as a career counselor, Kathleen is an accomplished author, has published 4 books about career life transitions, including my favorite, Get a Job, 10 Steps to Career Success. She's a frequent speaker and media guest. A graduate of Fordham University, Kathleen is currently pursuing a master's degree in theology at Georgian Court University, where she also serves as an adjunct instructor. Back with us on This Week in America, Kathleen Brady. Kathleen, welcome back to the show.
So good to be back, Rick.
It is great to have you with us, and I love the book, Get a Job, 10 Steps to Career Success. We've talked about it a number of times on the program. Today on the show, we're going to talk about something that, a topic that you discuss in seminars and in workshops. That's unconscious bias and assumptive thinking. And this is really a fascinating topic. As we get into it, explain a little bit, maybe sort of a definition of what unconscious bias is.
You know, it's interesting. There's a great definition. I'd like to read it to folks because it's not mine. It's for University of San Francisco. Their Office of Diversity and Inclusion came up with this great definition. Unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. And everybody holds them. These beliefs about various social and identity groups, and these biases stem from our tendency to organize social worlds by categorizing. So it's important that people sort of understand that this is not something we do consciously. This is about how our brains are designed to function. And so, there's a lot of neuroscience behind this, and I won't bore your listeners with all the scientific gobbledygook, except to say that at any given moment, our brains are processing about 11 million pieces of information. And so think about it. You're walking down the street. It is looking at sights and sounds and colors and smells, and it's processing all of those things. And so it's only able to, functionally handle about 40 at a time. And if you think about it, that's good. Otherwise, your head would explode and you wouldn't be able to walk down.
Exactly.
So we've got to kind of put our like things together so that we can get through every moment.
When we look at this, and it's interesting, you talk about the way the human brain is hardwired, and you say the process, it processes information through systematic categorization. So the mind is doing this. We're not even aware of what's happening, but our mind is putting things in categories that subconsciously will impact our thinking at a later time.
Exactly. And it's things that we have sort of learned behaviors, and we've learned these things, cultural learning through cultures and language and sort of our life experiences, behaviors and customs that you just grow up experiencing, sort of, our individual life experience. I mean, think about it. If not to pick on you for a minute, but if every experience I have had with a white man with glasses, gray hair and glasses, has been bad, my assumption before you even open your mouth is this is going to be a bad interaction.
Exactly. Yes.
And so part of it is trying to bring some of that unconsciousness to our conscience so that we can be better communicators and have better relationships.
I was just going to ask that part of it, the goal of talking about unconscious bias. Talk about that when you do the seminars, the workshops, and you're talking to people that are getting information on this, probably many for the first time that maybe have biases and don't realize it. Talk about the goal. What do we hope to accomplish, and can we change the way we think?
Absolutely. I think the goal, and everybody's got slightly different goals. My goal in talking about this stuff, there's diversity and inclusion is so important in the world of work, just not only for moral issues of right and wrong and how we treat each other, but even business reasons. You want to have a lot of these different voices at the table. And one of the challenges a lot of times for me in trying to do diversity training is, I'm a white privileged woman. So people don't necessarily, they're already a little bit suspect of that. So for me, when you're talking about these unconscious biases, I want it to be broader than just about race or sex or sexual orientation, and all of it kind of make people aware in a way that's a little bit less threatening. Because if you can start to say, well, I've got some prejudices against, or some unconscious biases against salespeople versus the administrative team, or lawyers versus the non-lawyers, or what might it be, then they can expand their thinking and they say, okay, well, no, these same principles may apply to Black versus white, or male versus female. And so it's really just about not saying you're a bad person because you've got these unconscious biases, but just they're there. So let's put them out on the table and explore them and pick them apart and see if there's any validity to them or how we can move past them. And usually that's what you want to do, is move past.
And you mentioned diversity, and you talk about diversity. That actually means more probably than we think it does. It's more than race, gender, and religion. There are other things that fall into that diversity category that we may not realize.
Right. And it's even interesting too, because like I said, it's in the law firm world, for me, it's the, support staff versus the lawyers, the partners versus the associates. So we make certain assumptions. You are a partner, you're going to behave this way, may or may not be true. But we base it on our experience of, when I've had interactions with that type of person before, this is how they've behaved. We have those ideas in terms of, men and women, or parents, right? This is somebody who is 30 years old. She's probably going to go off and have children. Maybe, maybe not. But your experience has been anytime you've hired somebody in their 30s, that's what happens. So so rather than just make that assumption, you want to ask a question. And that's probably a bad example, because you probably don't want to ask somebody in an interview, or you're planning to have babies. That'll get you in trouble. But
other than that, ask a question and listen to the answer and go from there. Kathleen Brady, our guest on the program, Director of Coaching for Preferred Transition Resources. The website is preferredtransition.com. Go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly. What are some of the skills that are needed in trying to determine if, in fact, we have some of these unconscious biases that you talk about?
I think the first thing you want to do is practice active listening. And when I talk about active listening, I don't mean just what people say, but you want to look at the totality of what you see in front of you. So you want to be listening for the words and the tone and the situation and the body language and all of those things, to sort of think about, are those aligned with what your perceptions might be? And then ask a question. And you've got to do it in a way that allows you to suspend judgment. So it is, I might have my preconceived notions about you, but I'm going to ask a couple of clarifying questions to make sure that my assumptions about you are true or not.
Kathleen Brady, our guest on the program. We're talking about diversity, inclusion counseling that she does. We're talking about the problem of unconscious bias and assumptive thoughts that we have that aren't necessarily beneficial and, in fact, detrimental. As we look at this, talk about some of the requirements that, as we enter into all of us doing a little soul searching here to see if we fall into this category, and if we're harboring some of these thoughts that we really shouldn't be. How do we go about doing that? What do we need to look inward and see if we may be influenced by these?
I always think the first thing is, let's get rid of this good-bad paradigm. I have these unconscious thoughts. I just do. And rather than say you're a horrible person because you have them, what you want to do when something surfaces is ask yourself, where does that thought come from? Why do I believe that? And is it true in this specific situation? So it's really about trying to suspending judgment on it and not denying it. Because one of the most harmful things in this whole diversity conversation is when people say, I'm not prejudiced. This doesn't happen. I love all people. And maybe, but there again, our brains are almost hardwired to be more comfortable. It's called an affinity bias, to like people who are who are like us.
Yes.
Where because we get them, we understand their thought process, and it doesn't mean we don't like other people, but we have that natural affinity. And if you think about it from a diversity perspective, if white women prefer white women when they're hiring, they're always going to hire white women because
Yes.
they sort of get it. They understand that person, and they're making judgments that may or may not be true about that person just based on something that they see. And so it's an affinity. And they might say, well, I'm trying to help more women, or they're more like me. But is that equitable? That at the end of the day is the question. Is that fair to others? And if you've got one type of person in positions of power, and there's this affinity bias, we're always going to be hiring in our we're not going to. It doesn't open the doors for people who have different points of view and different thoughts, because they make us perhaps a little uncomfortable. But it's only uncomfortable because we don't understand it. And when you ask the question, you start to realize we're more alike than we are different.
If people look at this and go, why should I really care? You have a study, an MIT and University of Chicago resume study that's really eye-opening and shows if we don't address this, the problems, even though they're not conscious problems, the problems can be immense and change a lot of lives.
Yeah, this was sort of surprising to me, because I would think, people in HR and in recruiting are probably the most mindful about these kind of issues. But MIT and the University of Chicago did a resume study, and they sent out 5,000 resumes to about 1,250 employers. And the key distinction on the resume was the name. And so they had some resumes that had what would be typically identified as a black name versus a white name. And so they sent 4 resumes out with these different names, one of each race that was average and one of each race that was sort of superstar. And what they found was that typically white resumes received 50% more callbacks. But what was really troubling about, I guess to some extent, people of color would say they're not surprised by that because that's been their life experience.
Yes.
But I thought what was particularly troubling was highly skilled white resumes received more callbacks than the average whites, which you would expect, but there was no difference for typically, the average black versus the highly skilled black resume. And again, all of the content was exactly the same in terms of their experience and all of that. It was all done just by the person's name. So there is this perception, Leroy is not going to do as well as Mary. Or Peter, so a name that, and that's just a horrifying thought, and that's something we want to be aware of. So when we look at it, we realize we're doing it, so we can stop doing it. That's it. It's about breaking that cycle.
And if we're not aware of it, that sort of falls in the unthought category. It's not something that's top of mind. So how do we outsmart that? How do we actually find out if we do have these issues and how we deal with them?
I think the best thing to do is to start being sort of mindful. And I think a lot of recruiters now are not looking at names. They're just looking at skill sets, are kind of taking the names off as a way to be helpful. I think some of the technology we have helps with some of that because they're looking for keywords. So names and addresses don't matter so much. But again, I think sometimes you got to put things side by side and just start being a little bit more mindful and look around and say, why is this? And how am maybe I'm judging that person differently because they're different from me than I ought to be. And so it's just about having a curiosity, I think, is probably the right way to think about it. I've got to be more curious about the choices I'm making. The other thing too, I wanted to mention, because I think it's so interesting, is, you talk about microaggressions, that is sort of the casual immigration of folks. And that's one of those things that I go, oh, microaggression, that's like just the phrase. I sort of dismissed that myself. And then I started thinking about how important language is and how we do that sometimes, not meaning to, but we don't realize then we're perpetuating stereotypes. So one of the, I'm not proud to admit this, but like in our house, when somebody's being sort of wimpy or not, we'll say, oh, don't be such a Sally. right? Sally about
Yes.
that.
Yes.
Well, so that is implying that if you are a woman, you are, that's a woman trait. So we are helping just in casual, and we laugh, and we don't mean any harm by it. And in our family, we're all women, we're all professional women, so it's we clearly don't believe that, but yet we're somehow perpetuating that because we're feeding into this whole notion that women are, wimpier than guys are. So it's, again, watch the language that you choose when you're speaking. Am I adding to this kind of perpetuating this kind of notion or unthought, feeding into it?
A couple of minutes left in the program. It's interesting because you talk about this in front of groups, and you give them an opportunity, a little test. They get a chance to see if they have any issues. As you're doing this at the end, after talking through everything with everybody who's there, what's their reaction? Is there sort of like a light bulb moment where you see in their faces that, well, wait a minute, I didn't realize I was doing that, but I think I am.
I think there often is that light bulb. And I think one of the most important things is it goes in both directions. So it is not just, it's not just white men who are doing these. Women are doing it. People of color are doing it. We do it to each other because that's the way our brains function. And, I always laugh. I think back when I was in college, and, I grew up in a very white neighborhood, and I was in college, and there was, I became friends with an African-American woman, and we were chatting, and I'm half Italian. And she said, oh, when I was growing up, you don't invite Italians to your house because they're scary people. And in my family, it was like, oh, we don't know black people, so they're scary because we don't know them. And so it's the fear of the unknown. And so the whole purpose of this is to have that dialogue, to say, I don't really understand your background. Help me understand it. Tell me a little bit more about how you grew up, and let me tell you a little bit about how I grew up. And then you start to realize, again, we are more common than not. And you're building those explanations, those. Is that you again?
No, that's somebody else calling in. Your next interview is lined up.
We're calling in for you. Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. So, I think, again, the whole purpose of this is to explore and acknowledge your unconscious bias. Just like admit it's there and just explore it. Don't be afraid of it, and say, yeah, what? I don't have a lot of friends of that type of person. I wonder why. And maybe it's worth having a conversation with them, and not necessarily buy into the media images we see or whatever preconceived notions that we have. And just the more you know, and it could also be that and say, what, some of my assumptions are true, and that's fine too. If that, but you don't want to be assumptive. You want to sort of test your hypothesis before you kind of lock into a position.
Excellent discussion. I really appreciate you breaking this down for us. It is interesting how the brain is hardwired and categorizes all of these different pieces of information over the years. So something that might have happened as a child 40 years ago could impact on the subconscious nature, the way we approach something or think about something now. It's been a fascinating discussion. With us on the program once again, Kathleen Brady, Director of Coaching for Preferred Transition Resources. Her website is preferredtransition.com. Kathleen, it is always fun having you on the program. We always learn something. Thank you so much for being with us on the show once again.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much, and hope to talk to you again soon.
You're welcome. Kathleen Brady, our guest on the program. The program is This Week in America. You'll find us online at thisweekinamerica.us. And we're back on today's program right after these messages.